Hey there, my name's Lockie. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer and it's great to have you with us. In this video, we are going to go through data loss prevention policies, or DLP. DLP covers a wide range of scenarios where we need to prevent the spilling of data or stop data from moving into areas that it effectively shouldn't be. There's three key areas we're going to be looking at as part of this video. The first is how to actually plan out your DLP policies. It's not something you want to do without having a good idea of what you need to achieve. I'll show you just some practical steps of actually getting them created. And then I've got an extra section focused on DLP within network traffic. This one's an interesting addendum to the broader DLP conversation, so we'll make sure we get that one covered. If you're looking at the Information Protection Framework, this is available over on Microsoft Learn at learn.microsoft.com. You'll find more information about how the data loss prevention policies fit within the Prevent Data Loss portion of the framework. Now let's get ourselves started with our first major topic, the planning phase. Before we actually go into the portal, hit create and get ourselves started with our DLP policies, we need to make sure we know where we're rolling it out and honestly, why we're rolling it out. There's some clear things that I want to cover within this, but the big one is this. I want to make sure that not only do you understand how DLP functions, but also the why. Why are we actually putting this and what areas do we have to think about when we are actually creating that plan? Once we've done this, we will go through and talk about how simulation mode works a little bit. And I also cover a couple of things around licensing and roles. There is a bit of nuance that you need to think about when we are going through and building out DLP more broadly. So let's get ourselves started with the first topic. Data loss prevention, DLP, is focused on going through and protecting sensitive information across the Microsoft 365 stack. Now, it's used in a number of different areas, but ultimately its goal is generally to avoid both unintentional or unauthorized sharing of sensitive information. It is an absolutely critical layer of protection, especially in environments where you've got high levels of collaboration and/or big regulatory obligations that you need to meet. Now, DLP works in a number of different modes. Effectively, there's different avenues we can use. It starts with sensitive information types. If we can ID if something is a credit card number, medical ID, something like that, we can effectively use that pattern to be able to work out that a sensitive piece of information is here. Once we are able to do that identification, we can then apply consistent controls on how we want that data to actually function, what happens when we find it across a wide range of different systems. So no matter whether you are working within Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, effectively whatever you need, we can make sure that the protective actions that you're working with are going to have a consistent behavior. Now, DLP does actually go beyond blocking style behaviors as well. We can also focus on things like policy tips to guide and ensure users know why this action is being blocked in the first place. And dynamic enforcement is also available. When we get to the demonstration portion of this video, I'll show you how adaptive protection works in a bit more depth, but we'll come back to it in a little bit. Now, the implementation of DLP has to start with a clear planning phase. There is a step-by-step process that you need to follow to ensure that when collaboration occurs, not only are we not restricting too hard, if we restrict too much and rush into configuration, we're going to lead into not only missed risks, but user friction, which means they might try and work around our restrictions. So we need to first start with an easy identification plan. The 4 steps are first to start the planning phase with an identification. Who's actually important in this conversation? Security, IT, compliance, legal, all of these people need to be involved in the conversation of what we are blocking and how we're going to block it. Now, this is important because there is a chance of not only a false positive, but a true positive that could impact the day-to-day life of an individual in the organization. Once we actually do identify that data, though, we now need to define what it is we're actually looking to restrict. Is it financial records, health records, PII, intellectual property, something internal to the organization? That's just as important as being able to actually work out how we're going to block it. Once we have a scope, not only an understanding from a stakeholder perspective, but also a scope of what needs to be blocked, choose the right piece of technology to actually create that restriction. There's going to be clear goals that you need to set, and it's mostly focused around, is a sensitive information type the right use case? Is an exact data match the right way to go? There's effectively different technological implementations we can follow, so what is going to work best for the particular scenario you're working with? And last of all, we need to think about locations. Now, locations is not just about finding a particular SharePoint that things need to be rolled out to. Locations can go well beyond the traditional scope of standard policies. Think end user devices. Do we want to block something on an actual endpoint that someone utilizes day in, day out? Do we want to block an action in browser? Do we want to ensure that we're logging at the network level? Are we looking to restrict just when someone's accessing via an online environment? There's many, many different avenues we can utilize when we are actually creating a location-based restriction, and that is required as part of the structure. Make sure you are planning this out and thinking about where it is going to be most effective to apply those sorts of restrictions, because it isn't always clear from the get-go. Now, if we can go through and build this out, ultimately, the end goal is to get a deployment going where we have automated actions that can take place. Because there is an automation component to this, we will want to deploy this out in a simulation mode first. The testing component is going to be critical because, well, even with the best of intentions and the best planning, there is still a decent chance that there is going to be an unintended impact for a policy that you roll out. Make sure that you roll things out in this simulation mode first, and feel free to also turn on things like tooltips. This will notify users that in a theoretical scenario where you enforce this via a block, they would have been blocked in this case. If you have a sample set of users that are assisting you with actually testing out these different rule conditions, looking at the different reasons that you may or may not implement it, or trying to help you find where exceptions may be required, make sure you educate them on what part of the process in the simulation you're working with. It's also good to go through and adjust things like sensitivity at this stage. This is your confidence level that you can apply to a DLP policy. High, medium, or low, what is the level of confidence you have that if we see this, effectively a breach has occurred, or in better terms, something has triggered this specific rule? Every time a rule triggers, not only is an alert able to be raised, but we do actually also log any matches that are occurred there. This gives us an easy way to effectively track over time how things are going in a real-world environment. When you roll out a simulation, we're able to effectively run this across your environment and still get good information about how things are actually being put in place. Now, within the applications themselves, there are a couple of different places that we can apply simulation. Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, the usual suspects there. But we do also support simulation mode on endpoints themselves. So don't feel restricted about testing things before you roll them out. The majority of common scenarios are supported within that DLP simulation state. Now, there are a couple of key prerequisites we need to think about when we're actually rolling out DLP, so I'll make sure to just cover those now so they're in your head. The first big one is licensing. Users that you wish to utilize DLP for, the core DLP components are covered under E3 or G3. This is Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive. But if you need some of the advanced features, such as DLP on endpoints, the adaptive protection, you are going to require an E5, G5, or A5 license. So make sure you've got the right licenses assigned. On top of that, this is actually quite a high-level administrative role, the ability to administer and work with DLP. So you need to ensure that the right people have the correct permissions, either information protection administrator or a compliance administrator role there. Last of all, there is an audit logging feature that must be enabled to utilize DLP. This is actually an optional thing within the environment. Audit logging broadly is not turned on by default. So if you are looking to use DLP, you must make sure that audit logging is turned on before you start. Once we do have our policies in place, there's also some additional nuance around the actual configuration of those policies. How do you want to raise alerts? Is one trigger of this policy enough that we can effectively subdue them for a little bit? We can just bundle them together. Or do we need to know about every single trigger as a separate alert? It depends on the policy you're writing. When we do notifications around incidents, who needs to know? That's going to be different for every organization. Sometimes a security team, sometimes an identity team, sometimes the compliance team, sometimes legal, and sometimes all of the above. You need to ensure that you're configuring this and managing this as you roll your policies out. Include this in your stakeholder negotiations and the conversations you have with them. And of course, do you want a user to be able to override this? I'm going to show you some scenarios in the demo where we do and do not want users to be able to override a DLP policy. There's no one right answer, but there is some pretty clear-cut examples of when we would or would not want this, so I'll make sure to show those off. Now that we've completed our initial planning phase, we know what to expect and at least some of the key things we need to think about. I'm going to show you what you need to think about from an administrative perspective. There's more to it than just going through and getting the plan right. We also need to be able to implement the thing. So I'll show you how to actually build out your DLP policies. Note that there is loads of templates for us to utilize, so you don't need to keep things static. We also have the ability to use some adaptive protection based on different user risk profiles. We can use Defender for Cloud Apps to enforce DLP. There's a lot of different areas that I want to make sure that we can cover here. So let's get ourselves started with just an initial creation process. When we actually go through and we want to create a policy, there's realistically two main ways to achieve it. You can either create a custom policy. This is where you target certain sensitive information types that you're interested in or certain scenarios, or you can instead look to the flexible policies that are available in the template section. If you're trying to work towards a specific regulatory scenario or a common organizational need, things that most people will need to do, this is a great place to begin. There's pre-built configurations for things like GDPR, HIPAA, PCI DSS, and other common standards within there. What's great about the templates is that they actually go through and include all of the sensitive information types that are most relevant for your scenario out of the box. So you don't have to do a full rework. You can still augment them, though, by adding in additional sensitive information types as required. If instead you want the most flexibility, go through and simply set things up using a custom option. Select custom down the bottom, and it will allow you to go through into the next step and create things from there. Most of these templates are focused on just getting something out of the box, of getting you the things that you need without too much additional work. But if you are looking to do some additional steps beyond just the initial setup, there is also the ability to look at some of the adaptive policies. Now, either way, we can set these up in either a block, restrict, notify, justification sort of mode. You get configuration no matter which way we go. But adaptive protection offers an interesting augmentation, which is user risk. Utilizing the insider risk management component of Purview, we can effectively calculate how risky a user's actions are broadly. So based on the behavior that they exhibit compared to their peers, we can give a risk level to prevent disruptions for low-risk users, but increase the protections and guardrails when a high-risk user attempts to use a certain tool or access a certain type of information. Risk can be elevated in a number of different ways, and DLP policies can effectively just be scoped to use this user risk level as one of the conditions for triggering. There's some interesting things that we can utilize this for, but ultimately, if there is a scenario where you can think that, say, blocking sharing of certain files when a user exhibits unusual behavior would be useful to you, this is where we would want to use it. Now, adaptive protection really is focused on removing friction for standard users, for everyday users, and ensuring that we can put in more restrictive policies that only apply at the moment that our users are at the highest level of risk or represent the highest level of risk to us. Adaptive is certainly not the only way to go, and you will find that most of your policies are going to use either a custom or a standard template. But it's a great augmentation, especially where we are focused on extremely high risk or a very high level of sensitivity with our information. Now, beyond this, we do also have DLP within the Defender for Cloud Apps ecosystem. This one allows you to go through and do policy-based protections, but from the Defender ecosystem perspective. Using the same sensitive information types that we've been building out and the same sorts of policy structures, we can actually create file policies that detect and restrict certain types of sensitive data. One really great unsung piece of Defender for Cloud Apps that's not as utilized is its ability to go through and look at third-party applications. There is integrations across a wide range of different cloud applications, not just within cloud providers like Azure, but more broadly within the ecosystem. And policies can be applied to prevent certain types of files or certain sensitive information types or even sensitivity labels being actually sent to these third-party systems there. We can also use this simply as an alerting system to ensure that when something is restricted or is triggering one of these policies, we can ensure that the exposure is notified. Because it is an alert, that means direct integration into Defender XDR, the Sentinel ecosystem, and all of the other security products that we utilize. So not only is this going to be useful for you within the data team working on exposure and working on compliance, this will be extraordinarily useful for those in the security space. So consider it as a way to extend what you do beyond the standard scope. You have the ability to view real-time alerts of violations of policies as well, so consider this a way to effectively log when users are potentially taking this extra risky activity and then be able to follow that up after the fact. Speaking of which, we should talk about the DLP analytics. There is actually a data identification system within DLP analytics to help identify certain risks. Now, the goal here is essentially providing you reports, different reports to look in different common areas. So oversharing is a classic example where we are looking to see how sensitive data is being used and shared amongst the organization. We can then determine if that's happening too often. That might tell us something about the way in which data needs to be shared, a potential blocker that people are having to work around, or honestly, just that maybe we don't have things set up correctly. It also gives us a way to be able to prioritize areas where policies might be a little too lenient in what they're doing. Maybe we need to apply additional restrictions where we haven't really considered them before. Beyond this, there's also a policy recommendation support. This is great for looking at scope adjustments. Often we tend to put scopes quite wide or even very, very narrow, and this gives us a bit of ground to justify the middle. Look for ineffective policies where there's a lack of coverage or policies that are too broad that we might be able to restrict and refine further. Speaking of the refinement, if you're seeing a high number of false positives, the policy refinement report will give you details on exactly that. Trying to find ways to enhance the effectiveness and effectively reduce the amount of effort that you have to put in chasing false leads. Now, it does take up to 7 days to generate insights in these reports, so please keep in mind this is not designed to be a day one approach. This is something you're going to utilize over the weeks and months after implementation to go through and ensure that everything is being done effectively. Consider this your methodology to go back, check your work, and ensure that everything is working exactly as intended. Now, last of all, if you don't need the specific reports, the raw data is still available to you. Activity tracking has a dashboard which allows you to look at alerts and logs and see how policy violations are actually tracking up amongst the org. If you're looking for ways to work within incident response, compliance tracking, anything in that sort of space, it can be very worthwhile to go through and look at the DLP alerts. This gives you ideas of thresholds and severities, and that's all filterable and configurable. This also, because of its direct integration with Sentinel and the other pieces of the stack, gives you great ways to be able to track that. And you can even go through and create custom workflows with Power Automate. The Explorer more broadly gives you things like just an easy interface to be able to view what you need. And because of that filtering system, it's a great companion piece where you are working in the investigative space. All right, now with the baseline set, I think we should go through and actually set up some policies here. Let's go through and into the Purview portal and we'll create some DLP policies. I'm going to create a couple of simulation policies to show you how things are working. We'll do a little bit of stuff within Microsoft Defender as well around file policies and Defender for Cloud Apps, and we'll make sure we get all of that set up. Okay, now we're over in the Microsoft Purview portal and we're going to head straight to the Solutions tab. In here, we need to go select Data Loss Prevention. DLP sits within the broader governance stack and is part of a broader piece of the ecosystem focused on sensitive information, pattern matching, etc. So we're going to use that to be able to start applying some policies. Now, it's important to note that you don't have to create every policy from scratch. In fact, if you head across to the Policies tab, you'll find that there is some existing examples already there. Now that it's loaded up, you can see things like the default Office 365 policy, the default policy for Teams, the default policy for devices. These are there as baselines, and we can go through and customize them as required to make them more operationally appropriate for the particular organization we work for. But more commonly, rather than replacing or modifying these, we'll go through and create new policies and put them higher up the priority list. Now, when I select Create Policy, I'm presented with two different options. The first is Enterprise Applications and Devices. This will be the most common one that you select. But inline web traffic is also available where you're using Edge for Business and some of the real-time actions we can take there. We'll stick with the commonplace and we'll focus on device policies and broader policies within the general DLP structure. Now, first of all, we're presented with a range of different templates, and there is many different templates. These are designed to really handle very specific financial and compliance scenarios. So if there is something in particular you're working with, or you're working in a particular location, feel free to filter these accordingly and find a template that's most relevant to you. However, if you're working with something that is a little bit more customized or maybe is specific to your organization, a custom policy is likely the better approach. So let's go through and create a custom policy so we can see some of the different pieces that we can configure. First of all, I'm going to give this a better name than just custom policy, and we're going to call this DLP credit card information. There is actually an existing one that will capture some of this, but I want to specifically just restrict the sharing of credit card information via Teams messages. So a very specific, nuanced scenario here. What we're going to do is not worry about things like admin units to scope it down to a particular part of an organization, but instead focus on our location settings. Within the location settings, we can ensure granular targeting to exactly what it is we need to work with. And so Teams is the one we're looking at. We'll ensure that everything that isn't Teams chat or channel messages is deselected. You can also still filter based on users and groups as per normal as part of this structure. So if you need to ensure that only specific people are targeted, we can do so. Note that M365 Copilot Chat is also available within this if you need to go through and target that particular space for a little bit of the generative AI component. All right, so now that we've got Teams selected, we're going to go through and select Next and continue along through the rest of the setup procedure. Next, we have a quick little policy space. Note that Create Customize Advanced Rule is effectively where we are because we didn't use a template. And now we need to create the actual rules themselves. Templates often come with rules attached, but custom means we got to do the whole thing. We'll go through and define a quick name here. The name itself is just going to be something that's friendly and gets ourselves started. And we'll make sure that we give a clear description of what it is we're looking to capture. Because we can have multiple potential rules here, note that the rule name doesn't necessarily have to be 100% aligned with the broader collection that we're creating. Now, within the rule, we're going to choose what it is we're looking to match. And for our particular scenario, there's actually two things we need to check for. First of all, I want to ensure that this particular policy only applies to organizations external to us, i.e. if I send a message outside of my org to some other company, I want to make sure that we can't send credit card information over Teams. Makes sense to me. We'll go through and add a restriction that says I only want to match this with people outside of my organization, and then we'll add a secondary condition. We're going to use an AND-based filter here though. And or are your options that you have. And just means that we have to match both of these. And the second one is going to be, we want to look for a credit card number. Credit cards are quite unique in that they have an easy checksum to identify that something is a credit card number, even if it otherwise matches the same number pattern. So we'll select the sensitive info type and the built-in that is available for credit card. Now, with the two conditions applied, we have not only a high confidence match for when a credit card occurs somewhere in a message within Teams, we can ensure that this rule will only ever apply when a message is sent outside the org. Next, we have to choose what to do. Actions allow us to be able to define what it is we actually want to achieve here. And in our particular scenario, we want to either restrict access or encrypt the content. Encryption in this context is really focused on forcing someone to log in and state that they are someone who should have permissions accordingly. But what we're going to do is instead choose how we want to block this from going through. By default, block only people outside your organization is selected, so we're going to leave that one as is. Next, we've got a few options in terms of how we notify users. Essentially, what do we say to them so they know what's going on? So if they do get blocked, how should we notify? We're going to use policy tips here as a mechanism to do it. This is great for educational and coaching purposes to ensure that we can find better policy over time and change behaviors of users as we need to. We will also allow a user override in this particular scenario. Now, this is potentially a bit unusual for the sort of information we're restricting, but maybe we've identified a scenario where this is the only mechanism to take this action. If that's the case, we can choose how we want this override to work, either through business justification, someone needs to write out the why of why they're doing it so it goes into an audit trail, or override accordingly. Since there is going to be potentially an incident or an alert raised from this, we also need to set the severity of said alerts and incidents that may get raised and choose where alerts are also going to be put through. There's a number of conditions you can set about how often an alert will trigger, so make sure you keep track of that if you're interested in keeping things down to reduce noise. Maybe group some alerts together if you find it's triggering too often. With all of the baseline pieces set, including those different alerting pieces, we'll leave most as default and we'll hit save. This is all just a single rule within the broader structure. So we're using this as just one of the many things that we theoretically could enact this policy with. We'll run the policy in simulation mode and ensure that the tooltips present to users even if we don't necessarily go into a blocking state. We could also choose to enable the option to enable the policy automatically within 15 days if no user says anything. Basically, if we know we've got it right, we need no modifications, we can have it automatically enable. And that's the end of it. That's all of the things we need to do to be able to configure a policy out. Policy sync does take some time, so whenever you're ready, simply hit next, go through, hit submit, and this will publish the policy out to the users. Make sure you allow time for that propagation. This is not an instantaneous change, so it will take a bit of time to synchronize and go through together. Now, with our new policy created, there is a couple of other things we can do. Let's say that you are working in a scenario where suddenly someone has identified that, well, it's not just Teams messages. We want to capture this same sort of content when it leaves via email. Don't worry, any of the various policies that you see here, you can simply select and you can edit later. Additionally, if you need to, you can also make many of the changes, alterations, creations that I'm looking at via PowerShell. So feel free to do it that way if that makes more sense from a programmatic perspective or just because of your way of working. In order to edit that policy, all we need to do is select it and then select the pencil. This will allow us to go through, make modifications as required, and make any updates we need. In our case, we're going to ensure that this also captures emails as they leave the organization, but otherwise, we'll leave all the other conditions the same. It is genuinely that simple to just update a policy over time, so if you do need to make any alterations, not too much to it, simply make the change and then hit submit. Now that we're back, remember that by default, policies that are created will go down the bottom of the list, effectively the bottom priority. You may wish to reorder these different policies in a different state, so you get an idea of what is going to be enacted first. Remember, broadly speaking, you want the higher specific policies to be at the top of the list, and then the lower priority broader policies to be at the bottom. We can simply reorder this by going through and opening up the additional actions on any of the policies that we see, and then we can choose to move them up and down through the list or automatically change them to a specific priority number. Here we go, and being able to just quickly change the priority for this one. and our new order is applied. So now we have a clear set of hierarchical priorities with the DLP credit card protection in the spot that we want it, over in priority 4. Next up, we're going to head over to security.microsoft.com to do some work with Defender for Cloud Apps. Because Defender for Cloud Apps has a number of different potential policy avenues, it can be a great extension into the easy sort of policy state that we've been working in so far. What we will do is head over to Cloud Apps and we're going to configure a policy focused around files that looks at the same sort of credit card information we've been interested in. In fact, it's going to use the same sensitive info type we created. We'll head on over there now into the policy structure and across to the Policy Management tab. In Policy Management, we'll be able to create new policies accordingly. Simply open it up and hit the Create Policy button. Once we hit Create Policy, select File Policy, and now we can start to configure when this policy should trigger, as well as under what conditions. First, we're going to go through and give the policy a name. As much as there are templates, this one's going to be a custom one focused on that credit card information. We can choose a policy severity that matches our particular scenario, low, medium, or high, choose a category, and then automatically put in the rest of the details around the description. Just make sure you fill them in so people know what to expect. We can change things like access level. So is this just for publicly facing documents? Is this for external or internal? Essentially choosing what we need and ensure that we've got an activation period. We can make sure that this applies to just future files on some arbitrary future date, or we can roll back to a previous date if need be. Next, we need to decide under what conditions we are going to apply this. Effectively, is there any filters we wish to put in place? Since I want to leave the all files and the all file owners as the same default filter, we're going to move straight to the data classification service and add in a condition that allows us to match based on the sensitive info type that we need to work with. I'm going to open this up and I'm going to select my sensitive information type. Within here, we'll be able to bring up all of the same SITs that are available within Purview. I'm going to do a quick search for credit card. And here we are, credit card number. Now, with that selected, there is actually some other modifications I feel are important to make. The first is, down the bottom of the page, we see two different options. Inspect Protected Files is the one that I want to change. Inspect Protected Files is exactly as it sounds. If a file is protected using broad information protection policy setups, this effectively allows you to go through and inspect those files additionally for sensitive information types. There may be some scenarios where you don't want this action to be put in place, so you can leave this unticked and protected files will not be scanned for certain SIT data. Now, as a final addendum, I want to talk about how DLP protection can be applied to various network devices in your environment. As long as we have the ability to extract things like logs, traffic information, etc., there are mechanisms to be able to work with DLP protection at the network level. This can be quite an interesting augmentation where we do need to go through and be able to effectively work with tooling or maybe even black or gray box systems that we don't have a mechanism to install endpoint onto or some other way. This gives us a mechanism to do some sort of network enforcement of common DLP controls where otherwise we simply don't have an option to do so. Let's get ourselves started with it. Now, network data security comes in many different forms, and as the layer of security, it represents one of our more outermost layers. If we think of identity as the outermost, it works our way in from there. Network data security, though, relies on inspecting data that leaves devices through supported providers. Now, network enforcement in the Microsoft stack uses Microsoft Entra GSA Internet Access, but if you've got a third-party SASE provider, that will also function here. The critical thing that we are doing is inspecting what people are accessing, when they access it, and using that to be able to target, say, certain groups or users with adaptive scopes based on apps to be able to see what it is they're actually actioning. Now, because we can inspect it at that network level, it doesn't matter if someone is using an application directly and natively on their computer, a browser, whatever. we can still inspect the traffic and perform enforcement of whether things should or should not be restricted based on your traditional DLP controls. So if you are sending, say, text and file uploads to some unsanctioned cloud application, this gives you a way as an administrator to provide that enforcement as a guarantee, even if a browser is not utilized that supports Purview, say Microsoft Edge for Business. Because of this, we've got some interesting extra additional places we can apply control now. Now, ultimately, it's probably best to know what this was intended for. This feels like it could be used for many different things, but the goal was to prevent sensitive information leaving through unmanaged or unsupported apps and services, not just browser applications, broadly applications. Because of its ability to inspect content as it leaves the device, we effectively end up with a way of just checking. A last check that sensitive text is not being put into a prompt for a generative AI, or a file's not being uploaded to some unmanaged third-party cloud provider. Because we can inspect it with the same sort of info types, sensitivity labels, etc. around the classification space, you've effectively got a scoping setup. If we can identify where sensitive data is potentially attempting to leave our organization, we now have a way to choose whether we want to sanction, unsanction, block, allow. We have data, and if we have data, we can finally add control. Now, because of the way that scoping works, this can be done on a user basis, an app basis, or both. As with most things in this course, there is no right way to do it, but there is clear use cases that we are focused on. Last piece is just to think about the actual configuration steps. So let's talk about where we enforce it, and then I'll talk about where it kind of fits within our broader DLP structure, because this is an augmentation. First, we need a SASE provider, so make sure you've got something that allows for that context there. Microsoft Entra GSA Internet Access is a common one within the Microsoft ecosystem. We need to actually enable network as a DLP policy control. This is part of the setup and something you saw when we were going through and creating up DLP policies earlier. You need to then create the DLP rule and scope it accordingly. So make sure you actually set it up and choose who this needs to apply to. And then once all of that is done, we're finally able to get DLP alerts and understand how people are potentially violating policies in our environment. Because it's all at the network level, this is just an additional layer of control and an additional layer of check and balance that we can apply to our environment. If you are looking to apply this within your space, effectively add in these components around network enforcement more broadly, just remember, this is not designed for every scenario. What it is looking for is a complementary layer, where if you have other data protection layers, we can now cover outbound traffic paths that just might not be caught otherwise. As long as you have that SASE provider to inspect and control outbound traffic broadly, we can leverage that as a way to do this inspection. Within endpoint, we do actually use the Purview endpoint agent to control local actions, so there is some other things that we can control around browser protections as well if you need to outside of the standard SASE space. But ultimately, this is a complementary product designed to work with other solutions and build a broader, better protection plan for your organization. In this module, we covered 3 key areas. The first was the planning and designing of DLP itself. Clearly, we need to engage stakeholders early and make sure that they understand what the implications are of potentially rolling this policy out. We need to make sure we get it right. Once we implement it, it's not a one and done. The creation and management, critical on the management piece, is all focused on making sure that your policy updates and grows over time based on user feedback and based on the number of false positives or true positives that you're seeing. We can increase or decrease scope as required. And if you need additional reach, we have the way to extend DLP protection out to the network traffic using SASE providers there. Thank you so much for joining us for this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.